Racist cop punches black man, then realizes he's the mayor. Officer Jack was used to being in control. One glance at someone, and he believed he knew their story. But when he pulls over a calm, collected black man driving an expensive car, his anger flares, and he crosses a line he never imagined. One punch changes everything, because this man isn't just any driver. He's the mayor. Jack's world is about to unravel, and the consequences of his actions will leave him facing a truth more powerful than his badge. In the end, will Jack realize too late that respect is earned, not taken? It was a warm and sunny afternoon, and Officer Jack was on patrol. The streets were busy with people walking their dogs, riding bikes, and going about their day. Jack sat in his squad car, one hand resting lazily on the steering wheel, the other adjusting his sunglasses as he scanned the street. He had been a cop for nearly 10 years, and he liked to think he could read people just by looking at them. To him, the world was simple. People either looked guilty or they didn't. He didn't need fancy laws or investigations to tell him right from wrong. His gut told him everything he needed to know. Jack's eyes narrowed when he saw a sleek, shiny black car coming down the road. It was an expensive car, the kind you didn't see every day in this part of town. The car rolled by smoothly, its engine purring softly. Behind the wheel was a black man, dressed in a neat button-down shirt. To most people, it was just another car driving through the neighborhood. But not to Jack. "There's no way he owns that car," Jack muttered to himself, a sneer forming on his lips. He must have stolen it. Without a second thought, Jack turned on his lights and sirens, signaling the driver to pull over. The man in the car glanced in his rearview mirror, calmly pulling over to the side of the road. Jack's heart raced, not out of fear or nerves, but from a familiar rush of power. He loved moments like these, when he could remind people who was in charge. He parked his patrol car behind the man's vehicle and stepped out, adjusting his belt and walking with purpose toward the driver's side window. As Jack approached, his eyes locked onto the man's face. The man looked calm. Too calm, in Jack's opinion. He wasn't fumbling for his license or acting scared. Jack didn't like that. Most people would be nervous in a situation like this, but this guy just sat there, waiting patiently. His window was already down, and when Jack reached the car, the man greeted him with a polite smile. "Good afternoon, officer," the man said, his voice steady and respectful. "Is there a problem?" Jack didn't return the smile. Instead, he stared down at the man, his jaw clenched. Something about the man's calmness rubbed Jack the wrong way. It felt like a challenge, as if the man didn't take him seriously. "Step out of the car," Jack demanded, his voice cold and commanding. The man's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise, but he didn't argue. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong," he said calmly. "Can you tell me why I'm being asked to step out of my car?" Jack's anger flared. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone like this man. "Did you hear me?" he snapped. "I said get out of the car." The man stayed still for a moment, his calm expression not changing. Then, without a word, he slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. He stepped out of the car, standing tall and composed. He wasn't much taller than Jack, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made Jack feel small. It wasn't fear or defiance. It was something else. The man didn't seem intimidated, and that made Jack's frustration grow even more. "Hands where I can see them," Jack ordered, his hand hovering near his belt, close to his taser. He wasn't sure what he expected the man to do, but something in him felt uneasy, like the situation was slipping out of his control. The man held his hands up, palms facing out. "Officer, I'm not resisting," he said softly. "I just want to understand what's going on." Jack ignored the man's calm words. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man was mocking him somehow, that his calm demeanor was some kind of act. Jack took a step closer, standing just inches from the man now, glaring into his eyes. "This car," Jack growled, "is it yours?" The man nodded. "Yes, it is. I can show you the registration if you'd like." Jack's hands clenched into fists. Everything about this situation made him angry. The man wasn't scared. He wasn't cowering. He wasn't begging or pleading. Instead, he stood there, treating Jack with respect, but not fear. And Jack hated it. He wanted the man to be nervous, to fumble, to act guilty. But none of that was happening. "No way you own this car," Jack muttered under his breath, though the man probably heard him. Jack's heart pounded harder, his mind racing with the unfairness of it all. He felt like he was losing control, and that was something Jack could never stand. His frustration was like a fire, burning hotter by the second. The man spoke again, still calm. "Officer, if you'd like, I can." "Shut up," Jack snapped, cutting him off. The anger he felt was now fully visible on his face. The situation was spiraling, and he could feel it. But instead of stopping and thinking, Jack let his emotions take over. The man wasn't scared, and that made Jack furious. "Do you think you're better than me?" Jack suddenly shouted, his voice rough and angry. His words cut through the air like a sharp blade. The man didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. Instead, he took a deep breath and spoke softly, with respect. "No, officer. I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I just want to know why you've pulled me over." Jack's blood boiled. How could this man just stand there, talking so calmly, as if none of this was a big deal? How could he not be scared? Jack had the power here. He was the one in control. But why didn't the man seem to care? Why wasn't he trembling or begging? "You think you're smart, don't you?" Jack snarled. "You think you're going to talk your way out of this?" The man's calmness didn't break. He just looked at Jack, his eyes full of something Jack couldn't quite place. Sadness. Understanding. Whatever it was, it made Jack feel uneasy, as if this man knew something Jack didn't. "Officer, I'm just trying to cooperate," the man said gently. "I don't want any trouble." That did it. Jack's control snapped like a twig under pressure. The words "cooperate" and "no trouble" rang in Jack's ears like mockery. Without thinking, without hesitating, Jack's fist shot out, connecting hard with the man's face. The punch landed with a sickening thud, and the man fell backward, hitting the ground with a dull thump. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. The sound of the punch seemed to echo in the stillness. A few people on the street had turned their heads, their faces frozen in shock, but no one moved. No one dared to intervene. Jack stood there, breathing heavily, staring down at the man now lying on the ground. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his ears. The adrenaline coursing through his veins left him shaking, but it was already too late to undo what had happened. The man didn't move for a few seconds. He just lay there, one hand on his face where Jack's punch had landed. Slowly, he began to sit up, his movements careful and deliberate. He didn't rush, didn't fight back, didn't even touch Jack. He just sat up, one hand still on his cheek, where a bruise was already beginning to form. Jack's eyes were locked on the man, his chest still heaving. He waited for the man to shout, to argue, to call for help, to do something. But instead, the man slowly stood to his feet, never once taking his eyes off Jack. When he was standing again, the man dropped his hand from his face and looked at Jack. His eyes were calm, but now there was a deep sadness in them, like he wasn't angry at Jack, but disappointed. Like he had seen this before, too many times, and was tired of it. The sadness in his eyes made Jack feel a strange sense of unease. For a moment, a chill ran down his spine. "Officer," the man said, his voice low and filled with pain, not just from the punch, but from something deeper. "I don't want to fight with you." Jack's throat tightened. His mind was spinning, but he couldn't back down now. He had already thrown the punch, already crossed the line. He couldn't show weakness. Not now. Not in front of this man. "You're resisting arrest," Jack growled, his voice thick with anger, even though the man had done nothing wrong. "Get down on the ground." The man's expression didn't change. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just stood there, looking at Jack with those sad, tired eyes. And that made Jack even angrier. Why wasn't this man afraid? Why wasn't he begging for mercy? Just as Jack was about to grab the man and force him to the ground, something unexpected happened. A police car pulled up to the curb. 2 officers stepped out quickly, looking tense. Jack barely glanced at them, his attention still on the man in front of him. But when the 2 officers got a closer look at the man Jack had just punched, their faces went pale. One of the officers, a tall man with dark hair, rushed over to Jack, grabbing his arm. "Jack, stop," he hissed, his voice urgent. "What are you doing?" Jack jerked his arm away, glaring at his fellow officer. "I'm handling the situation," he snapped. "This guy's resisting." "Jack," the other officer interrupted, her voice shaky. "Do you know who this is?" Jack's brow furrowed in confusion. He looked back at the man, who still stood there quietly, his eyes now flicking between the officers. "Who he is?" Jack repeated, his voice rising with frustration. "What does it matter?" The tall officer swallowed hard, his face pale. "Jack," he said in a low voice. "That man, he's the mayor." Jack's world tilted. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The words "he's the mayor" echoed in his mind, louder than the sound of his own heartbeat. He looked back at the man, really looked at him this time. The recognition hit him like a truck. He had just punched the mayor of the city. His stomach dropped, and his legs felt weak. He wanted to speak, to say something, but no words came out. The man, no, the mayor, stood there, still calm, still sad. But now Jack could see something else in his eyes. Disappointment. Part 3. The realization. The moment hung in the air, heavy with tension. Jack stood frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His pulse raced, but confusion clouded his mind. Why were his fellow officers acting so strange? Why had they paled at the sight of this man? They were acting like they had just seen a ghost. The tall officer, still gripping Jack's arm tightly, pulled him aside, his face twisted with fear and disbelief. Jack yanked his arm away, anger and confusion bubbling up inside him. "What is wrong with you guys?" he barked. "I got the situation under control." But the 2 officers didn't look at Jack. Their eyes were locked on the man. No, the mayor, who was still standing there, calm and composed despite what had just happened. The tall officer stepped toward the man, his voice shaky. "Mayor Thompson, are you okay?" The officer stammered, his words filled with fear and respect. Jack blinked, his mind racing. Mayor. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The man he had just punched, the man he had treated like a criminal, was the mayor. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath Jack's feet. His head spun as he tried to piece everything together, but the truth was sinking in like a cold, hard stone in his stomach. The mayor didn't answer right away. He just dusted off his shirt calmly, as if nothing major had happened. His expression hadn't changed. He still looked calm, composed, and sad. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet. Jack watched, his throat dry, as the mayor opened the wallet and handed something to the officers. A driver's license, maybe, or some sort of identification. The tall officer took it with trembling hands, glancing at it quickly before handing it back, his face turning even paler than before. He exchanged a quick, panicked look with the other officer. Jack's heart raced faster. What could possibly be in that wallet that had both of them acting like this? Jack's mind reeled with questions. Was this some kind of joke? Was the man pretending to be the mayor? But one look at the faces of his fellow officers told Jack this was no prank. This was real. The tall officer turned to Jack, his eyes wide with fear. He stepped closer and whispered, his voice trembling. "Jack, that man. He's the mayor." The words felt like a punch to Jack's gut, harder than any blow he could have thrown. His entire body stiffened. For a moment, everything around him seemed to stop. The sounds of the street, the hum of nearby cars, the faint murmurs of bystanders. It all faded into the background. Jack could only hear the thudding of his own heartbeat in his ears. "No," Jack muttered, shaking his head slightly, trying to deny the truth that was crashing down on him. No way. But there was no escaping it. His mind raced through the past few moments. The stop, the shouting, the punch. Every second of it replayed in his head, and it was worse with every replay. He had punched the mayor. He, Officer Jack, had punched the most important man in the entire city. Jack's mouth went dry. His throat felt tight, like he couldn't breathe. His legs wobbled beneath him, threatening to give out as reality settled in. He had crossed a line so far he couldn't even see it anymore. And now, there was no turning back. Mayor Thompson stood still, looking at Jack. His eyes weren't filled with anger or hatred. No, they were filled with something worse. Disappointment. Deep, heavy disappointment. Jack felt like he was shrinking under the weight of that look. He had always been the one with the power, the one people feared. But now, in front of the mayor, he felt small, insignificant, and weak. "Officer, I won't press charges," he said quietly. The words were soft, but they felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on Jack's chest. Jack's eyes widened. He wasn't pressing charges. For a brief second, relief flashed through Jack's mind, but it was quickly replaced by something much worse. The mayor continued, "But you need to know what you did today was wrong. This can't go on." His words carried a weight of experience, like he had lived through this kind of injustice many times before. Jack could hear the sadness in the mayor's voice, but also the finality. The other officers stood nearby, still pale, still silent. They knew what was coming next, and so did Jack. His career, his pride, everything he had worked for, gone in an instant. The crowd continued to murmur, the weight of Jack's actions pressing down on him like a tidal wave. He could feel their eyes on him, judging him, and he knew that from this moment on, he would never be seen the same way again. Jack's knees buckled slightly, but he forced himself to stand tall, even though he felt like crumbling inside. It was over. Jack stood there, his feet seemingly glued to the pavement, unable to move. His entire body felt heavy, like he was carrying the weight of 1,000 bricks on his shoulders. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the quiet murmurs of the crowd and the distant hum of traffic. Mayor Thompson stepped forward, his calm, measured footsteps making a soft sound on the ground. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum. For a split second, Jack thought the mayor might yell, might unleash the fury that he so clearly deserved. But when Mayor Thompson stopped just a few feet away from him, there was no anger in his eyes, no shouting, no fury, just calm, deep, unsettling calm. The mayor spoke softly, his voice carrying a kind of weight that no shouting could ever match. "Officer Jack," he began, his tone even and controlled, "I've seen this kind of behavior far too many times in my life." Jack's throat tightened. He could feel his pulse quickening. The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Mayor Thompson didn't look like a man who was angry. He looked like a man who was tired of the same old story playing out over and over again. Jack could feel his face growing hot with shame, but he didn't know what to say. What could he say? Nothing could take back what he had done. The mayor continued, his voice never rising above a calm whisper. "There are too many officers like you," he said. "Too many who think they can act out of anger, out of prejudice, and not face the consequences. But this," Mayor Thompson gestured to the crowd, the officers, and finally back to Jack. "This has to stop." Jack's chest tightened painfully, like a vice was squeezing his heart. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to somehow make this right, but his mouth felt dry, and his words wouldn't come. He just stood there, frozen, his body betraying him, as guilt and regret began to flood his mind like a wave crashing over him. Mayor Thompson took a deep breath, his gaze never wavering from Jack's. "I won't press charges," he said, and for a moment, a flicker of relief passed through Jack's chest. But the relief was short-lived. The mayor's next words hit harder than any punishment the law could deliver. "But your career as a police officer is over." The words felt like a punch to Jack's gut, harder than the one he had thrown at the mayor earlier. His vision blurred for a moment, and his legs felt weak. The world around him seemed to spin, his mind struggling to grasp the full weight of what had just been said. It was over. His career, his identity, his pride. It was all slipping away, falling apart right in front of him. Jack's arrogance, his quick temper, his misguided sense of power, it had all caught up with him. The thing that had given him a sense of control, the thing that made him feel superior, was now the very thing that had destroyed him. His actions had led him down a path from which there was no return. Jack's chest ached, the regret almost unbearable. If only he had taken a moment to think. If only he hadn't let his anger control him. If only he hadn't been so quick to judge, to lash out, to punch. But it was too late now. Much too late. As the reality of his situation sank in, Jack barely noticed the two officers stepping forward, their faces grim and their movements stiff. They each took one of Jack's arms, gently but firmly, and began to lead him away. The cold metal of the handcuffs they had placed on him earlier felt heavier now, digging into his wrists as he walked. With each step, Jack could feel his life unraveling. Everything he had worked for, everything he had thought he stood for, was crumbling like sand slipping through his fingers. His arrogance, his belief that he was invincible because of the badge he wore, it was all meaningless now. He had thrown it all away in a moment of anger. As Jack was escorted toward the police car, the murmurs of the crowd followed him like a ghost, their eyes piercing through him with judgment and disbelief. He kept his gaze fixed on the ground, too ashamed to meet anyone's eyes. He had been the one in control, the one who held the power, and now he was the one being led away, powerless. Out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw the mayor still standing there, watching him. Mayor Thompson hadn't moved. He didn't need to. His calm presence, his quiet strength, spoke louder than any words could have. Jack could feel it, deep in his gut. He had lost, not just his job, but something more. He had lost the respect of the people around him, the respect of his fellow officers, and worst of all, the respect of himself. As Jack reached the police car, he glanced back one last time. The mayor was walking away now, his back straight, his steps slow and deliberate. Jack watched him go, the weight of his loss settling over him like a heavy blanket. It wasn't the mayor's words that stung the most. It was the realization that Jack had brought this on himself. His anger had destroyed everything he had ever valued. The door to the police car opened, and Jack was guided inside. As the door closed behind him, he realized something he hadn't understood before. Respect and kindness. Those were the true measures of power, not fear and force. But Jack had learned that lesson too late. Now all he had left was the silence of his own regret. Did you enjoy the story? What are your thoughts on the mayor's decision? Don't miss out on more gripping, emotional stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Subscribe now so you don't miss out on tales packed with suspense, unexpected twists, and unforgettable characters.